On April 14, 1865, 5 days after the Confederates had surrendered, President Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head at Ford's Theater in Washington by a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. It was on a Good Friday. Lincoln, America's 16th president, would hang on for some hours before he eventually died the next day on April 15, 1865. America's tallest president to this day will be the first to be assassinated. This is the full story of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, just days before the American Civil War ended. Nevertheless, the joy of this day would be quickly broken by the news that President Lincoln had been assassinated. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14, 1865, while watching a performance at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. The next morning, Lincoln died, but it would be another 2 weeks before his killer was apprehended. Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth, was born on May 10, 1838, to prominent British actors Junius Brutus Booth and Mary Ann Holmes. He followed in his parents' footsteps and made his stage debut in Shakespeare Richard III in Baltimore in 1855 at the age of 17. He had been involved in the Know Nothing Party, a nativist political movement at the time a year before. Booth went on to become a well-known actor who wowed audiences with his energetic performances. He made his admiration for the Southern secession known when the Civil War broke out, nearly having himself expelled from the Albany, New York. Booth agreed to act when the tide had clearly turned against the South and the war's end was obvious. He devised a plan to abduct President Abraham Lincoln with the help of his associates. They intended to smuggle Lincoln to Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, once he was in their hands. However, things did not go as expected. On the day of the scheduled kidnapping, March 20, 1865, Lincoln failed to show up at the designated spot. Richmond fell to Union forces 2 weeks later, and General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9. After failing to kidnap President Lincoln and realizing that the scheme was no longer feasible, now that Richmond was under Union influence, Booth switched to Plan B, assassinating President Lincoln. He found out that Lincoln and his wife would be attending a production of Our American Cousin at Ford Theater by chance. His intention was to assassinate Lincoln with the help of his accomplices, who would then assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, effectively truncating the government. The Lincolns were accompanied to the play by Henry Rathbone, a young Army officer, and Clara Harris, his fiancée. The community was seated in a private box with a view of the stage. Booth slipped into Lincoln's box around 10 p.m. and shot the president in the back of the head with a pistol. Rathbone, surprised, attempted to apprehend the attacker right away, but Booth stabbed him in the shoulder. John Wilkes Booth then jumped from the balcony to the stage and exclaimed, "Sic semper tyrannis," the Virginia state motto, which means "thus ever to tyrants." The crowd's initial response was that it was all part of the act before Mary Lincoln's screams were heard. If he broke his leg jumping to the stage or later during his escape is debatable, but Booth managed to flee. He had a horse ready to transport him out of the city. His two co-conspirators, however, were not successful in their attempts. Since Booth was a well-known actor, Many in the crowd recognized him right away, and the Union Army was soon after him and his accomplice, David Herold. The two came to a halt at the home of Samuel Maude, a doctor who had helped Booth with his broken leg. Dr. Maude was sentenced to life in prison for his efforts, but his sentence was later commuted. On April 26, Union troops apprehended Booth and Herold and surrounded the Virginia barn where they were hiding. Herold gave up the fight, but Booth remained inside. The troops set fire to the barn and in an attempt to root out the fugitive, a sergeant shot Booth in the neck as the fire grew and he was finally taken out of the building alive. John Wilkes Booth held on for some time before asking that his hands be raised to his face so that he could see them. Staring at his hands, Booth said his last words, "Useless, useless." After Lincoln was shot, a young doctor in the audience, Charles Leally, rushed to the presidential box to treat the president. Some soldiers then carried the dying Lincoln across the street to a boarding house and laid him on a bed. When the Surgeon General arrived at the president's bedside, he concluded that Lincoln could not be saved and that he would most likely die during the night. Friends, members of Lincoln's cabinet, and the Vice President Andrew Johnson stood by Abraham Lincoln's bedside as his soul slowly left his body. In the adjoining room, First Lady Mary Lincoln, accompanied by her eldest son, Robert Lincoln, was distraught with grief. At 7:22 a.m., Saturday, April 15, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was pronounced dead. He was 56. After the president died, he was escorted by armed cavalry to the White House. On April 18th, Lincoln's body was carried to the Capitol Rotunda, where he was laid in state for 3 days. Afterwards, his remains were boarded onto a train that transported him to Springfield, Illinois. Thousands of people lined the rail tracks along the funeral train path. He was buried alongside his son, William Lincoln, at Oak Ridge Cemetery on May 4, 1865. So, why did John Wilkes Booth kill President Abraham Lincoln? Lincoln's decision to enact the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free black slaves in order to crush the Confederacy, had killed him. President Abraham Lincoln also indicated a wish to extend the voting rights to some African Americans, at the very least, those who had fought in the Union ranks during the war, and expressed a desire that the Southern states would extend the vote to literate blacks as well. The American Civil War was fundamentally a conflict over slavery. Nevertheless, emancipation, when it came, would have to be gradual, according to Lincoln, because the most important thing was to keep the Southern rebellion from severing the Union permanently. The end of slavery was just the beginning for a long fight by African Americans for full citizenship in the United States. In the 1960s, racial segregation in the South continued, from public accommodations to colleges. In August 1963, an integrated crowd of more than 250,000 swarmed around Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington, where Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech.